Okay, so welcome back. In this part of the tutorial, I'm going to walk through some of the code which I've built and essentially kind of what the functions are and the purposes are. So that way, if you're building or thinking about building an S3 website, this is kind of what you can expect to build. So here we go. There are a couple of modules which I've created here in Terraform. So I've used Terraform for this. And one is an S3 bucket module. These are all local modules. I've got Cloudflare, certificate management, and I've got a Cloudfront and S3 kind of outputs as well. So S3 bucket domains and website endpoints as well as Cloudfront aliases. Okay, so this is for debug purposes. So what does each individual module entail? So I've got a main, which is in this case S3 bucket. If I go to S3 bucket, output and variables. So here was something that's quite interesting. When I created this, I had a method of doing this with the ACL, which is the bucket ACLs. And this works fine. There's nothing wrong with it. But there's an easier way of doing it, which I found, which was to use the AWS S3 bucket ACL. And then I created the public read permissions onto that particular bucket. So what that means is everything within that bucket can be seen publicly, but only in the read formation. There's no public write to it. So you can't publicly write to my bucket. It's just not going to happen. And that's a feature which has been added into AWS recently, because before you were able to do such a thing. Now, in Terraform, at least you can actually set the ACL to public read. Here we have the AWS S3 object loader. So this is what uploads the files to my S3 bucket when it gets created. So this is what uploads the files, and it sets an ACL called public read on the object level. So what that means is that any object which is uploaded up to AWS S3 has the public read permissions on it, and that's within the folder called website, right? So that's this folder here, which has all of my website stylings, all of the content, like the follow-through imaging, all of that good stuff. And as you can see, I've got it all here as HTML, and then one style CSS sheet. Okay, so that's what that does. And of course, we've got the MIME types. So here are all the MIME types which are supported. So as I mentioned earlier, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, GIF images, JPEG, and we can add more onto this as it's a locale. And then we have the bucket name with the bucket name as a variable and some tags. So my variables here are my bucket name. And of course, I've got the outputs here, which are the bucket domain, endpoint, and the bucket endpoint. Now, the thing that I want to make clear here is that there are two ways of doing this, both of which are okay. However, one is easier than the other. So, for example, this AWS S3 bucket ACL, which I have down here, which relies on the ownership control. This particular version I got from AWS S3 API, which is the CLI output. And this essentially says give full control for the canonical user, which is myself, and then to anybody who is the public, essentially, give them read ACP and read permissions, right? This is what's generated out of the fact. And of course, we've got bucket owner preferred, which is the ownership of the objects inside of the bucket is the bucket owner. Okay. But what I found was that this particular ACL setup does exactly the same thing, and it was a lot easier and simpler to do than the other way which I mentioned. And that's because it's better practice. So you're supposed to use an IAM policy, but ACLs worked fine for me, so I kept it an ACL and not used a bucket policy. Okay, cool. So that's the AWS S3 bucket one done. And we will go to the next module call, which is going to be in Cloudfront. And now, in Cloudfront, there's some cool things that happen here. Really cool stuff. So I did try the AWS Origin Access Control, but what I found by doing this was that I was getting a lot of errors in terms of the resolution. So what that means is I was getting it redirected to my S3 bucket website domain, which is not what I wanted. I wanted www.dannystech.net to be present. So to encounter that, what I did was I said create the custom origin config, because you don't need a custom origin config if you're working with origin access control. And essentially what I did then was I created the HTTP only protocol policy. The reason why you want the origin protocol policy to be set to HTTP only is because that avoids 504 errors when trying to retrieve content using an alias such as www.dannystack.net. Which brings me on to my next point, which is aliases themselves within Cloudfront. Now, I have set this as a variable, which is called variable alias names. And essentially what this is a list of strings, right? Or you could use a set of strings, but a list of strings looks fine. Now what these are CNAMEs to the origin. Okay? No, sorry, that's wrong. These are CNAMEs which are accepted by the certificate manager in order to retrieve the content. In other words, to get a pass to retrieve the content rather than getting a 403. If you don't do this step and use a custom origin, in other words, a custom name, then what will happen is you'll get a 403 error and you won't be able to retrieve anything when using your domain name. So what that means, to put that into perspective, is, say for example, you're going to go to dannystech.net, you don't have a custom alias, you try it, you'll go somewhere else essentially. Because there's nothing to register, there's nothing to create that link between what's acceptable through Cloudfront and what your domain name is. Okay? Which is also why we have the ACM certificate ARN. So here's another very important point. Your certificate that you create in order to allow the alias names to go through needs to be created in US East 1 region. The certificate ARN, in other words, the ACM certificate, Amazon Certificate Manager certificate, has to be created in US East 1. Okay? We'll get onto that in a second, but let's go back over the code. So I've created IPv6 enablement. I've enabled this. Default root object is going to be index.html. Custom error codes. So, for example, you get the 200 response code, which is OK. And 404 for anything which is not found. And you get a response page for an error, which is error.html. Okay, that's my custom page. Now for the caching bit, like we talked about earlier, right? So in other words, you know, cache, like we talked about earlier with that bucket, in other words, having things centrally, we are catching two methods. One is called the get request, and the other one is called head. Okay, so these are the allowed methods that we're allowed to do. So in other words, you know, we get data when we do things like curls, for example, and we cache that particular request as well. So if anybody wants to get something from one page, it's cached at Cloudfront, and then we say, right, okay, we take that particular traffic off the origin, which is what we want. So that S3 bucket, we don't hit that if somebody, for example, wants to get my CV again, or two people get my CV, it goes from Cloudfront rather than S3 because that has already been cached. Okay, my CV page has already been cached. Okay, and then we have the query forward string as being false. We don't have any forwarding cookies, so that's fine. Viewer control policy, I put down a HTTPS only because this is the viewer control policy for Cloudfront and not the origin. That one that was HTTP is only for the origin to connect onto Cloudfront. So in other words, the S3 bucket towards Cloudfront is via HTTP. From the viewer, which is where you're viewing the website from, to Cloudfront, from Cloudfront to you, that's all HTTPS. Okay, that's the reason why there's two viewer control policies. And then we compress that data as well, so we're using things like gzip. Now, the cache, the order cache policy, I've set down to the content, so anything within the content is cached. The target origin ID is just a made-up string, which is attached to the origin. So, for example, that's where our Cloudfront distribution is. That hits it. So it's just a mapping, essentially. It's just a mapping of S3 bucket name towards Cloudfront. And now we've got that as false. We've got cookies as none as well. And then we've got HTTPS only, as I mentioned earlier. And I've enabled HTTP 2 and 3. The reason why I've done that is because I wanted to have quick support, which makes the website even faster. And I didn't want it to slow down, so I enabled 2 and 3. Geo restrictions is none, so there's no geo restriction. And then I enabled a viewer certificate, which allows me to add the custom aliases in. So the reason why this is on is because I wanted to have the ability to do www. And I also wanted to have the ability to set the custom aliases. Okay, so this is the minimum version there as well, which I've added in as a security measure. So that way we support TLS 1.3. Okay, outputs is just the Cloudfront alias. So in other words, the domain name, which is given when the Cloudfront distribution is up and running. Cool, so that's Cloudfront. Cloudflare, well, is got an error for content. Oh, right, yeah, this is the wrong, okay. Yeah, this is the Cloudfront provider, the Cloudflare provider, which is messing around. And all of a sudden, I've had to put this down. Never mind. Okay, so going back to Cloudflare, a couple of things here. So I've used the data Cloudflare zone example. The reason why is because I wanted to be able to not remember a code in order to get to the zone, because the API key in Cloudflare is zone protected. So in other words, I can only utilize one zone per name. And then what I've done is I've created www, which is a CNAME towards the record of the, I don't remember what this is now. This is the record towards Cloudfront, I believe. That's Cloudfront record. Now, what else I've done is I've done something called a for loop. So this is a for each. And what I'm doing is I'm iterating over the domain name and the ACA and the ACNC names, right? So in other words, all of the details which are passed in from the certificate manager in regards to the list of certificates which needs to be approved. So if you think of www.danistech.net or even danistech.com, think of those domain names. What we're doing is we're taking all of that information which is passed from the certificate manager and all of those record names, those values, all of that stuff. What we're doing is we're creating records for them. So the way it works is that certificate manager gives you a record, an output, and essentially says, okay, you want to validate that the domain name called www.danistech.net exists. In order for me to do that, I need to give you certain types. So in other words, this is a CNAME record which exists between this particular domain and this particular value, right? So you think of it as a link. That's basically how it works. It says 123.123.123.123 is an alias for something 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 at cloudfront.net. Yeah, that's essentially how it works. This is basically what that's doing. It's creating that record. So once we get that information, right, for this for each, we put that into a variable called I. So in order to store that into the I variable for I in this particular thing, I.domain name. So we take that part of the domain name. Inside of there lies something called resource record name, resource record value, and resource record type. And then once we have that, we take each value for the name and for the record and the type to create our record. That's why we have the for each at the top. So we do a for, store all those variables in name, record, and type, and then we use them back again for the content, the name, and the TTL. And then we don't proxy it. Okay, so that means it doesn't go through the Cloudflare network. That's the reason why we do that. Yeah? So hopefully that makes sense. I'll go through this just one more time just to be sure. You feel free to skip this part. But essentially what we're doing is we're taking stuff from the certificate manager because we're passing it in from the certificate manager module into Cloudflare. And then we're saying for each iteration of stuff which is found in the certificate manager CNAMEs variable, okay, find the domain name. Sorry. So what we're doing is we're saying when you get this particular variable called certificate manager cnames, within there, I want you, within the domain names, to find the name of each domain, find the record, the type of each domain, and I want you to find the record of each domain. So this is the name of each domain, which is in there, the record name, the record, which is the value, and then I want you to find the type of record. So this could be a CNAME, an A, anchor record, called A, for example, that kind of thing. Record is just the content value, so we're just saying blah, 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 blah. And name could be danistech.net, whatever, that kind of thing. Okay. Now the reason why it says each.value.name is because of the for each at the top. So all we're saying is when you go through this loop, this iteration, the name is going to be equal to the name which is found, the record will be equal to the content which is found, and the type will be equal to the type which is found. So we're just making a mapping. Proxied false just means we're not putting it through the Cloudflare network. Okay, so that's pretty much Cloudflare. Certificate Manager, and in Certificate Manager, I've done two things. Set the validation method to DNS, and I've also set the aliases to the aliases. The reason why is because you have two different certificates. One is the root certificate, which is the root domain name, which I have down as domain name, and subject alternative names is everything else which is separate to the main domain. So if you think about danistech.net, that's the root domain. www.danistech.net is called a subject alternative name in a certificate because it's got nothing to do with the root, it's just an extra part. Now I could have that as www.danistech.net. That would also be a subject alternative name because that's an alternative to the root domain, which is star.root.com. Although in this case it would be a little bit more tricky because I'd have to have a different root domain, which would be star.star.myroot domain. Okay? Because there's extra parts. Okay? Hopefully that made sense, but to reiterate, what that means is star.danistech.net is my root domain. www.danistech.net is a subject alternative name because it fits underneath the root. Star is just a wildcard. So what that means is you could type anything that you want there. ttt.danistech.net, perfectly valid, because it's a wildcard. Okay? And it means it covers the two scenarios there, which is www. and the root itself. Right? So that's pretty good. At least that's the idea. It's supposed to be star anyway, but AWS might not like, I don't think likes stars. I need to check that in my variables, in my module call. Yeah, it doesn't. So I've just did it as danistech.net. So yeah, that's still perfectly valid. That's still perfectly valid as well. Okay, let's have a look at the certificate manager again. It's done. Outputs. Yeah, here we go. So we got the ARN, which we used earlier on, and we got our CNAME values, which is there as well. Which are domain validation options. So this is the method. This is the attribute which is supplied for us to validate the domain. So in other words, this is all this stuff which is used for the validation. We just do that autonomously. Cool. That's pretty much it. And of course, I've got the website content down here as well. So yeah, that's pretty much it, I think. I think we covered everything. So yeah, if you've got any questions, anything that you want to know, let me know, and I'll get back to you. Thanks for watching.